Hi there. I have the distinct pleasure today of interviewing Jojanneke van der Toorn. She's a professor by special appointment of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender workplace inclusion at Leiden University and an associate professor of social and organizational psychology at Utrecht University. Jojanneke, welcome.
Thank you.
Could you introduce yourself to us, please?
Of course. Indeed, I'm a social and organizational psychologist, and my research focuses on diversity and inclusion in the workplace, specifically on the workplace inclusion of LGBT employees, researching what factors contribute to an inclusive workplace, what the barriers are for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender employees in doing their work, and understanding sexual and gender identity prejudice more generally.
So can you tell us a little bit more about your background?
Absolutely. I was trained as a psychologist and a cultural anthropologist. I did masters in both these at the Free University Amsterdam. And then I moved to the United States for a PhD at New York University in social psychology. There, I worked on issues of power and the maintenance of inequality and how both majority members and minority members contribute to this maintenance of unequal societies through psychological mechanisms that maintain the status quo. To unpack that a little bit, I did research on how people are motivated to believe that the world is a fair place out of needs to bolster our sense that there's epistemic certainty. So we want to feel that things have meaning and that everything will fall in place in the end, that people get what they deserve. And so we have this need for epistemic certainty to ward off threat and to feel that we all share the same reality. And these psychological needs mean that we're actually not as quick as one would think to identify inequality or unfairness around us. And this motivation is present both in people who are part of disadvantaged groups and people who are part of advantaged groups. And so together, we actually maintain these systems of inequality that we are part of. Towards the end of my PhD, I moved to studying sexual prejudice as one example of inequality maintenance. And I did a postdoc at Yale University working with other social psychologists there and started my own research program on this topic. And then I moved back to the Netherlands, which is where I'm from, to start a position at Leiden University. And then I got a job at Utrecht University. And then I got this special position at Leiden University to focus on this topic exclusively.
Thank you very much for that. Can we go back to the beginning a little bit? Because as I told you as well before, I'm very new to this topic. So could you define for us what exactly is the meaning of inclusion and diversity? What does it mean?
Yeah. Well, they're actually quite different. Of course, they need to go together to some degree, but diversity is really which people are in your company or which people are you trying to recruit to your company? What is their background? So diversity means that you have employees from different backgrounds, perhaps even different competencies. Everybody is different in the end. And inclusion has much more to do about whether people feel that they're part of the group and that in that group they can be themselves. So this sense of belonging and a sense of authenticity, being your authentic self, those really are the two dimensions that make up inclusion. A lot of organizations actually focus on diversity primarily. They think that once there is a diverse workplace, that inclusion follows automatically. But that's actually not true at all. We often see that that goes wrong. And so especially when you have a diverse workplace, you really need to work on creating this inclusive workplace to make that diversity be an asset to the company rather than a challenge.
So it seems to me that the words inclusion and diversity are two different parts of the spectrum. They're on two ends of the spectrum. In diversity, you have celebrating differences and, making sure that people have, recognition for who they are, whereas inclusion means everybody's equal.
That's an interesting perspective. That's not really how I see it. So I really see diversity as how many people of different groups are there. It's really counting people. and inclusion as a cultural element. So the climate in your organization. So celebrating differences, I actually think, can also be part of inclusion. It's not the only thing. There have been a couple of elements identified. So one is to value differences between employees. Another one is to make sure that all the policies in the company are equal for every employee, so that there's equal opportunity. And also that people have a chance to be part of the decision making rather than just simple recipients of other people's decision making. So those are some common elements of an inclusive workplace. But diversity really, to me at least, is about counting people and what are their backgrounds. You can have inclusion without diversity, because a very homogenous organization can be extremely inclusive to the people there, or feel very inclusive. They might feel like they belong and they feel that they can be themselves at work, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the organization is diverse. And that's often a challenge, because if you just measure the sense of inclusion in the company to determine whether you need more diversity, you might get the answer that there's nothing is needed because people were very included. But if it's a homogeneous group, it's actually quite hard to think about whether that same culture would be inclusive of somebody who comes from a very different background or experience.
That's really interesting. So let's talk about what you mentioned about epistemic certainty. I believe I got the terminology correct. I hope
Yeah.
people who are on the margins of society basically don't see inequality as clearly as others do. Did I get that correctly, or
No,
am I wrong?
no, that's not what I meant. I meant
Okay,
that
sorry.
everybody, regardless of your group membership, has this basic motivation. First of all, to feel good about yourself, right? We're all motivated to have high self-esteem. We don't always succeed, but we want to feel good about ourselves. We want to feel good about the social groups to which we belong. So, for example, I am a woman and I want to feel that my group of women is doing well. And at the same time, a third motivation we have is that we want to feel good about the system that we're part of. But the systems that we're part of are often unequal in many societies. And so this motivation to feel good about the system also might mean that you start to rationalize inequalities that are there, because it motivates us to want to sort of cover up the negative sides, just like we might do with our group. We are more quick to see flaws in other group members of different groups, or in other people different from ourselves, than we are to see closer to home. And so these three motivations that we have to feel good about the self, the group, and the system are sometimes at odds with each other. For example, if we're a member of a disadvantaged group, because then feeling good about your own group doesn't necessarily gel with feeling good about the system where our group is at the bottom, right? But so there are these sort of there is this challenge there for people, and depending on the context, one motivation might win out over another motivation. But this motivation to feel good about the system, which might mean that we downplay inequality and negative sides of the system, is present both in minority group members and majority group members. Probably more, and this is what we see in research, more in people of majority group members, because it also coincides with that group motivation that they have, right? There's other reasons for them to also want to justify the hierarchy in the system. But it doesn't mean that it's not there in minorities. And there is some research, including my own, that has shown that under certain conditions, minority group members are even indeed more motivated to downplay inequality. For example, when they feel powerless or out of control. And so these motivations contribute to the maintenance of inequality, these psychological mechanisms, which makes it really hard to combat them. We also see that majority members and minority members, they're socialized in the same system, in the same culture. And so to some extent, we endorse the same stereotypes of people, right? Because that's what we're socialized with. So even though a stereotype might be disadvantageous to our own group, people might endorse them to some extent. And we see that as well when we look at implicit stereotypes. For example, between black and white citizens, you see that white people have implicit stereotypes that white people are better than black people. Black people have the association that black people are better than white people, but the difference for black people is less big than for white people. So their implicit stereotypes are a little bit more towards buying into, white people being better. And these things are, of course, going to be in the way of actual change happening. At the same time, we do indeed see change, right? And we do see people who speak up on behalf of their group, who protest, etc. So it's not like these psychological mechanisms are enough to keep the status quo completely as is. There are efforts for social change and successes in that sense. But I think if we didn't have these psychological mechanisms that would be telling us, like, oh, keep things the way they are, the status quo is fine, because we don't know what an alternative status quo would bring, it makes us uncertain, or because we just want to make sure that everybody's on the same page, which is a lot easier when it comes to the status quo, which we know, than some unknown alternative reality. That could play a role there. And and of course, majority members also act on behalf of disadvantaged groups. There are lots of allies for LGBTI employees in organizations, and that's very important as well.
So I guess the $1 million question is, I mean, I think you've answered a little bit of that as well. Like, how do you restore the balance, right? Tell us a little bit more about the ally programs. I mean, how much evidence is there? I mean, what is the evidence that shows that, first of all, these kind of implicit disbalance exists in society, and what people have actually, what societies or what companies and whatever have actually done to kind of make the playing field a little bit more level for everybody.
Yeah. A lot of companies that have LGBTI networks open these networks to straight cis allies as well. I think that's important. I think it's good to also engage other employees in the company so that they can also understand what is needed to create an inclusive workplace, so that they can perhaps learn to speak up on behalf of LGBTI employees, but also, to just share this burden together. At the same time, I think it's important that these LGBTI networks can be a safe place for LGBTI employees. So there's a balance there, I think, between having that safe space where where it's just for LGBTI employees, and also having activities where allies can be part. There's not a lot of research yet on ally programs, but what I see in organizations is that there's quite a bit of interest in it. But people often just don't know how to be an ally. Yeah. So a lot of people assume that because they think they're not prejudiced, that they have positive attitudes towards LGBTI, or even a neutral attitude, that is enough to help the group. But it's often really needed that people speak up and to create culture change. So being passive is, in some ways, can be taken as being okay with the inequality that is there, even though you might not be actively contributing to prejudicial incidences. That's not enough.
So being an ally means that you have to be proactive, basically.
Yeah. So being sensitive to what's happening around you, if you see something, even when there's not an LGBTI employee around, that you speak up when somebody makes an insensitive joke, or that you might ask your employer, like, hey, we don't have an LGBTI network yet. Wouldn't that be something to start up for our employees? Or inquiring about other policy matters.
Thank you very much for that. So let's switch gears a little bit and let's talk about what you're currently doing on sexual prejudice. If I understood correctly, that is your current area of research.
Mm-hmm.
Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So we are looking, for example, I'm doing a lot of projects. One project is about stereotypes about LGBTQ individuals in STEM fields, so in science, technology, engineering, and maths, and how perhaps it's not just that people associate masculinity with science, but that masculinity also implies heterosexuality. So we're looking at that as an intersectional identity. Why is it the case that gay men, are particularly likely to drop out of STEM fields, whereas lesbian women are actually less likely than heterosexual women to drop out of STEM? So that's one project we just started to look into. Maybe it's really something about masculinity, the masculinity culture in STEM, which, because of stereotypes associated with lesbian women, might be seen as more fitting for them, but less fitting for gay men who are seen as more feminine. And another project is about the stereotypes that people have about non-binary individuals, or gender non-conforming people with gender non-conforming appearances, and how that might negatively relate to them being hired, or the extent to which they're given opportunities in a company. These are all projects I've just started, and my main line of research is on the factors that contribute to an inclusive workplace. How, for example, we've just published a paper on how feeling invisibly dissimilar is actually more strongly related to a lower sense of inclusion than feeling visibly different from other colleagues. So I'm interested in this because sexual orientation and gender identity is relatively invisible. People often have to come out of the closet for others to know that they're part of this group. And that sense of being invisibly dissimilar is actually quite taxing for people. And at least in this research project, we showed that indeed it relates to a lowered sense of inclusion, and that lowered sense of inclusion in turn relates to more work-related stress, more turnover intentions, so intentions to leave the company, lowered work satisfaction, and so has indeed real organizational implications. Unless there's a climate for inclusion, so people can feel different from most others at work, but that's not related to lower inclusion if people perceive the organization to really value that difference, right? So if you work in a company where that's the culture, that it's okay to be different, then being different is not related to lower inclusion. So that's a project that my PhD student Onur Shaheen just published, and we're continuing that line to think about or to examine, like, well, how can we then influence this climate for inclusion? How can organizations contribute to that image of the company as valuing difference, etc.? Not just the image, by the way, but also the practice, of course.
Of course. So I'm going to ask you a difficult question. What, in your mind, is the biggest challenge in your field at the moment when it comes to diversity, inclusion, LGBTQ prejudice?
That people take the topic serious and as implying everybody. So I think people might, at an abstract level, think that it's important to have equality in the workplace, but they tend to think about visible forms of diversity first and foremost. So people tend to think about ethnicity, to some extent binary gender, but not so much history of psychological issues, or invisible disability, or indeed sexual orientation and gender identity. And the problem, I think, for sexual orientation and gender identity in the workplace is that people really do not see it as relevant. They think, because they think of sexual orientation and gender identity to have to do with sex, that this has no place at work. But what they forget is that the heterosexual cisgender individuals are constantly talking about their own identities. They just don't notice it because it's the majority identity, and so it's woven into every interaction. It's the assumed identity, and so people don't even notice anymore, right? When a reference is made to a partner, they assume it's going to be a different sex partner, and when that's the case, that's not going to make them see that. So I think that for sexual orientation and gender identity, that's the biggest challenge, to explain that really it's not about sex. It's about your relationships, your preferences, your life. And if you cannot share about your life at work, that's going to really stand in the way of your interactions there, and therefore the work that you are there to do. And as I said, sexual orientation and gender identity is a more invisible form of diversity, which also in the academic literature has gotten less attention than visible forms of diversity, but for sure in organizations is getting less attention. Organizations have a real challenge that they assume that when they have diverse employees, that that's going to automatically bring them more creativity, more productivity, and better performance. This is called the business case for diversity, and you hear that a lot. Whereas in fact, research shows very mixed findings. So sometimes in some research, diversity indeed leads to more creativity, more perspectives coming together, etc. Whereas a lot of research also shows that diversity leads to more conflict and strife and not better performance at all. This is where the key is inclusion. Diversity is only leading to these things if people indeed are able to share their perspectives, that they can create synergy with their different backgrounds and really relate it to the task. So that's one thing. You need inclusion for these different backgrounds to actually have surplus value. But at the same time, there's also a misunderstanding, I think, about diversity, that people assume that when you're diverse because of your ethnicity, your gender identity, that means you have very different perspectives or very different talents, which isn't necessarily the case. So there's all these assumptions that also play into policymakers' ideas about what's needed in companies that I think are real barriers to creating positive change. So one thing, as I mentioned, is there needs to be more attention to invisible diversity. Second is we shouldn't assume that just because we have different people that means that they have different perspectives. And then just because people might have different perspectives, we can't assume that these perspectives will automatically be voiced and be brought together and then increase team performance. And yeah, in all these things, inclusion is the key.
So that's really interesting, Jojanneke. So you mentioned that conflict arises with diversity. That is what the research has shown, of course, or some research has shown at least. How much of this how much of this is seated in people's own prejudices? Because as we all know, there are some countries, some groups of people that are definitely a lot more prejudiced and a lot more shut down towards the idea of people being gay, and calling it a lifestyle instead of actually it being a part of who they are. How much of that is contributed to these people having these strong prejudices, and what can you do about this?
So yes, indeed, you are right that prejudice is underlying a lot of these processes. So when people are prejudiced against other groups, they indeed would prefer to work with people who are like them and exclude those group members. But it can also be about really mostly liking people who are like you. So you have work on in-group love versus, or there's a distinction between in-group love and out-group hate. It can be that you don't want to work with people who are part of other groups, but it can also be that you just really prefer to work with people who are in your group. Both are the outcome of prejudice, but there is a slight distinction there. And both can have the same effects, but they don't necessarily have the same mechanism.
Thank you very much for that. So what is your biggest project right now?
So right now we're preparing a new research project where we're looking at the possible tension between privacy and inclusion at work when it comes to collecting data on LGBTI employees, or data on the sexual orientation and gender identity of employees, including heterosexual cisgender employees. Um, what I've noticed over the past years working on this topic is that in organizations, there's really not a lot of knowledge about how the different groups in companies are doing in terms of salary, in terms of promotion opportunities, and in terms of their sense of inclusion. So what I hear from LGBTI networks is that they would be very interested in actually researching that. So asking employees, what's your gender identity, what's your sexual orientation, and then seeing if there are these group-based differences. Are indeed LGBTI employees held back compared to hetero cisgender employees? It's a way to actually map that out and then to be able to target it, to combat it. But organizations, understandably, are hesitant to do this because this might infringe on people's privacy. And especially when it comes to topics like sexual orientation and gender identity, people are very careful. Um, so we've noticed this, that on the one hand, organizations really want to work evidence-based, which means you need to measure things and then take targeted action. And on the other hand, they want to protect the privacy of their employees. So both motivations are in the interest of employees, but they can be at odds when it comes to these issues. And so this tension between privacy and inclusion is really interesting to us. And I'm collaborating with people from law and from the social sciences and even from cultural history, so from the humanities, in trying to approach this to understanding what are unintended consequences of policy decisions in this regard, what is actually the room, the legal room for collecting data on sexual orientation and gender identity at work, what are misconceptions and conceptions that policymakers have in this regard and how is this influencing their policy. In order, once we understand this, we can inform organizations on how to make these policy decisions. So we can show them, well, this is in fact a legal room. So it seems like actually there is much more legal room than organizations tend to think, but there are, of course, a bunch of boundary conditions for doing so. So we want to give these tools to organizations from a legal perspective, but also from a psychological perspective. What does it do to your employees when a CEO says, we're not going to monitor gender identity and inclusion? Are you then communicating, we don't think this is relevant, we're not interested in these employees? Or what does it do when you say, we really value privacy? Do people appreciate that? And what are the factors involved in whether people are actually going to share that information? So if you are monitoring identities, how do you make sure that a critical mass of employees is indeed participating in it? Because if nobody is doing that, then it's useless. So these are the questions. We're not necessarily taking a normative stand here. We're not saying you have to collect data, although evidence-based policy is indeed hard without doing this kind of research. But we just want to map out, if you decide to do it, what are all the things you need to think about? If you decide not to do it, then what are all the things you need to think about? And how can you make these well-considered policy decisions? So in this research, we're working in an interdisciplinary team, but also together with organizations. So the Workplace Pride Foundation is a platform for LGBTI workplace inclusion. It has over 60 members, multinational and national organizations. And with that platform, we work together in creating a community of practice where organizations share with us the questions that they have. We can feedback the research findings, and together we hope to come to this toolbox for helping organizations make these policy decisions. Elsevier recently hosted a members event for the members of Workplace Pride, where we kicked this off, and it was a wonderful event where we saw that policymakers have very diverse opinions on this topic and are really struggling to come up with with an approach there. And they have a lot of questions about what is in the law, a lot of questions about what are psychological consequences here, what should we do, and if we want to do anything, how should we do this? So that was really informative for our research. And that is something that I really value, because I believe in bigger, stronger connection between science and practice, to really be informed by what are the challenges, the questions that organizations deal with, and using that information to sharpen my research questions and inform my research, and at the same time communicating back what the research find, which may be very different from the assumptions that policymakers have, for example, to really bridge science and practice there, and make, in the end, make it possible to implement and develop better policy.
That sounds really amazing. I'm really looking forward to seeing this toolbox that you put together for organizations, because I think in this world it is so incredibly important that, organizations, it starts with the organizations and companies, right? It starts with the policy that they make, that, at least in your working life, which is where you spend majority of your time anyway, people feel comfortable to be who they are.
Yeah, I think the workplace is really a very important dimension of life. It's where a lot of people spend the majority of their day. It's also an environment that they didn't necessarily choose themselves, right? So it is an opportunity to actually meet different people. Our friends generally are from our neighborhoods or from our backgrounds, and so there tends to be less diversity there than there is in the workplace. So I think the workplace is really also a gate or gateway to creating a more inclusive society.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jojanneke. This has been so enlightening for me. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you today, and I really appreciate your time.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much.